of this session this afternoon. And basically we have three people who I think are probably the best prepared in sort of a grand region for looking at the question of Egypt's elections and the current status in Egypt and so on. And you can find a lot of their information. Our first speaker will be Sahar Aziz, who is just recently joined the faculty of Texas Wesleyan University School of Law. She has been here in D.C. doing a variety of things. She has worked in areas that make her one of the most informed legal experts on contemporary election and politics and so on in Egypt. We have my colleague Samar Shahata, who is here at the center, who is similarly disposed but less legal and more anthropological and sociological and political. He is assistant professor of Arab politics here at the CCAS. And then we have Michelle Dunn, who I was talking with her. She has now assumed a really interesting new job as the founding director, right?
Yes.
The founding director. I think you should make use of that. The founding director of the Atlantic Council's Referee Center for the Middle East. I was talking with her. I will miss being able to read what she used to write relatively regularly for Carnegie, but she promises me that she will continue to write. So we've got what should we say, the best show in town. Our ground rules are that they are each going to talk for about 15 minutes, and then that will leave us time for discussion and questioning. And so, without further ado, let me turn it over to Sahar.
Thank you so much. It's good to be back in D.C. It's good to see friendly faces and familiar faces, including Khalid Al-Bindi, who is one of our board members at the Egyptian American Rule of Law Association. And I should, the credit, anything I do that is informed by, that shows some expertise on Egyptian law is really a credit and a tribute to the Egyptian American Rule of Law Association, which is about 40 Egyptian American lawyers working together as a brain trust to support rule of law reforms in Egypt as we speak. This is where my technological savvy is. There we go. Okay, so I figured I would start with the conclusions first, or kind of my findings is maybe what I should say. This is based on a law review article that's going to be published in the Ford International Law Journal in August, and it's based on some very tedious and difficult research. Egyptian law is not easy to research, especially English, and trying to find translations. But these are kind of my main findings, facts. First, the amendments to election laws after the revolution are insufficient. They're definitely in the right direction, but more reforms are needed, and I'll explain why. Second, one thing that has happened, as a matter of fact, is that the Higher Elections Commission, which supervises the Shura Council and People's Assembly, the parliamentary elections, and the Presidential Election Commission have now been transformed into judicial bodies, as opposed to being quasi-judicial where they have political appointments. The quota for women has been eliminated, which has unfortunately created some, in my opinion, adverse impact on women and Egyptian women's representation in parliament. And Egyptian Copts remain inadequately represented. This isn't much of a change from before the revolution, but I think it's something that we have to talk about, particularly if we're going to talk about women. I think we have to talk about religious minorities as well. Okay, so what are my recommendations? Well, first, I think that it's at least worth a discussion. I'm not as confident with this recommendation, the first one of whether we should have the HEC and the PEC, the Higher Election Commission and the Presidential Election Commission, to be an independent election commission, which is much more of the norm, particularly in developing countries, as opposed to a judicially run entity. And it's worth a conversation. Now, I'll go into more detail about why that's a lot more complicated than it sounds, which is why I'm a bit ambivalent about it. Second, there needs to be a judicial appeals process. There is not an appeals process in place for the PEC and HEC, primarily because they're run by judges. And so And the PEC, which I'll go into in some details, there's actually a legal problem because it was put into the interim constitutional declaration without much thought. And as far as addressing the female representation and the religious minority representation, I think Egypt would be well served following Tunisia's model, which is where they require that every other candidate on a party list is a woman. And that is mandatory. In Egypt, the only requirement is that one woman within the list, and I'll explain the close part of this in a minute, one has to be a woman. She ends up being at the bottom, and it's really a meaningless requirement. And then this is my own recommendation, and I look forward to critiques of it, is I've been thinking, how do you get more Coptic representation? And I think that perhaps kind of like the gender ordering, you could have it where in the districts where you have at least 10% of the general population is Coptic, that you would require parties to put one Coptic candidate in the top 3 slots. And that might be a better solution, and I'll talk why I don't think a quota is a good idea. Okay, so that is just to give you a framework of what I found in my conclusions. Now we get into the really boring nitty-gritty election law. The reason why I'm using a PowerPoint is because there's no way I can hold your attention on this dry legal stuff for 15 minutes. These are the laws that get elections in Egypt. You've got 2 constitutional amendment or articles. Now these are the 1971 Constitution, which has been suspended. And then you've got 4 laws. Each one, as you can see, governs. And these laws are not just governing elections. There's just articles within those laws. And then you have some military decrees that have been issued post-revolution that, in effect, amend those other laws. Okay. Okay. So obviously, you've got to. You have to, when you talk about the law, you've got to talk about the Constitution. Egypt is in a bit of a bizarre situation right now because it has an interim constitutional declaration that I don't know what percentage of it, one could say 70, 80% of it was really unilaterally decreed by the military. There is I think, a bit of a spin about it, that it's based on a referendum. But the referendum which took place in March 13, 2011, right after the revolution was over, was very limited in scope and really dealt more with when should Egypt have parliamentary elections before or after they go into a very thorough constitutional drafting phase. And so, as you can see, 77% of the voters, the eligible voters, the voters who turned out, voted yes, and 23% voted no, and there was a 41% voter turnout, which was really high for Egypt. We're talking, I think, historically maybe 10%. And then after that, they realized that there was this big debate about, but what are we going to do with everything else in the Constitution? We amended some articles through this referendum, and so the military kind of, I think a lot of it, I take the more not sinister approach, I take the more incompetency approach to it, that I think they're not lawyers, they're not legal experts, everything is happening very rushed. So they said, okay, we'll just have this interim declaration. And the 39 and 76, which as you can see are part of Egypt's election laws, were adopted. And then they amended Article 88, which that was what transformed the HEC and the PEC into judicial bodies. Okay, so before the election, first, now, and you can see facially why it's problematic. And you have to remember the backdrop. The National Democratic Party, which was Mubarak's party, pretty much ran the government and dominated the government and established rules to make sure that their dominance in politics would continue. The Minister of Interior chaired it. 3 deputy heads of the Supreme Court of Cassation were on it. 6 impartial public figures, take that with a grain of salt, what impartial means. They were supposed to not have any affiliation with any political party, but I think in reality that was the case. 4 of them were chosen by the Parliament, with People's Assembly, and 2 chosen by the Shura Council, and then 3 of those 6 had to be former members of the judiciary. So I think that was an attempt to be a little bit more objective. Then there was the Technical Secretariat that was chaired by a political appointee by the Minister of Interior, and they reviewed the nomination applications and they vetted the candidates for Parliament. So they were the gatekeepers. So there's a lot of power in the HEC of who was going to get to play. Okay, so after the revolution, the military issued decrees in 46 and 110 of 2011, and that essentially amended Law 73 of 1956. And that's where you have the transition into a judicial body. They prohibited parliamentary appointments. They made the president of the Cairo Court of Appeals the chair And then these are the other members. They're all, as you can see, judges. They abolished the technical secretariat and replaced it with a judicially run general secretariat. So facially, this seems like a positive move. At least it's all relative to where you were to where you were going. And now, what is its mandate? So it is supposed to promulgate rules for elections monitoring by Egyptians and international observers, so it recognizes the role of international observers and that they should be there. Now, in the last elections, I don't know if that was implemented as well. There were many international observers that wanted to be there, but the judges actually weren't open to it as much as we expected. They appoint members and secretaries of the general election, polling, and county committees. These are the people in every governor that are actually implementing the election, so they're supervising those committees. Same thing with voter lists, making sure that who's actually eligible has really fit the criteria. This is also important. Rules for regulation of electoral campaigning, including equal time rules for TV and advertising. So all that also matters in whether a party has an advantage. And then the symbols on the lists. And then they declare the results, which is obviously the most important part of the elections, and then the runoffs. Okay, so this is really meant to start the conversation, and I'm very interested in hearing feedback, because this is my next area of research, is should the HEC, should the Higher Elections Committee be an official body? Pros, Egyptians trust judges relative to non-judges. So part of it is cultural, historical, anything, it's a little bizarre, but they have a lot of trust in judges compared to the executive branch and compared to, and you tell someone, oh, it's an independent commission, and they kind of laugh at you. Like, yeah, independent, right? Nothing's really independent. But somehow, I guess because the judges have been able to create quasi-independence in a very difficult political context. And then, so you've got this politicization. The cons, you compromise the judicial independence, and I've spoken to some Egyptian judges. They do not want the HEC or PC to be judicially run, because they feel then they become corrupted and tainted. What they want is to judicially review decisions by the PEC and HEC that is not judicially run. But they feel now that they're becoming entangled in what they call dirty politics, because politics is dirty. It's politics. And they don't want to be part of the political creation system. And then again, you've got a problem with the appeals process, because putting aside the fact that it's prohibited by law right now, which could be fixed theoretically, but who do you appeal to? You appeal to the same judges that made the decision, and so it creates a little bit of a problem. Okay, People's Assembly, just quickly, these are just some facts for you to know. It changed from 518 to 508. The quota was removed. It uses a mixed electoral system, which is a proportional party system where you go and you vote. There's a closed list, means you vote for that list. You don't vote for candidates. You vote for the party. And then when you vote for the party, however many number of votes they get depends on how many seats they get. So if they get 2 seats, then the first 2 named on their party get it. If they get 3 seats, they get 3, etc. So you as a candidate, it's very important where you're listed on the list. If I'm on a party list and I'm last, that means I probably won't get a seat unless that party just takes every seat in the entire district. And then independent candidate, that's the winner take all. That's the system we know here in America. So you vote for that particular individual. And 10 of them are appointed, and then you have this very convoluted and provincial and outdated farmer-worker quota. 50% of the People's Assembly has to be a farmer or worker. There's always fighting about how that's defined. People are exploiting the definition. I go buy some tracts of land and say, hey, I'm a farmer. Okay, I want to be under that because it's easier to get elected in. It's a guaranteed 50%. And then this just tells you kind of the point of proportional party representation. You shift the focus from individual candidates to political parties and their platforms. Some people have said that's a good thing in places like Egypt, because then it could force parties to talk about their platforms instead of just be personality driven and charisma driven, and people who can't, what are they going to deliver? And again, the ordering determines the outcome. And just to give you, this seat allocation is really important. This was something that people criticized the NDP for. Before the revolution, if your party didn't get at least 8% of the votes cast nationally, you didn't even have a right to get a seat in parliament. And NDP was accused, at least, of doing it on purpose to keep out minority parties and other parties. Now it's only 0.5%. That's essentially the minimum threshold for your party to even have a right to have a seat. Okay, and I won't go over this, is just what we know. The only thing worth noting is the Muslim Brotherhood usually used the independent candidate system to get its people in. They would openly say they were Muslim Brotherhood, but people pretty much knew because they were banned as a party. The Shura Council, the thing to note here is that they have no authority to pass legislation. They, a lot of people are calling for them to just be abolished. They're not what you would think of as the Senate here, where they also legislate and they're supposed to kind of keep in check the more unwieldy and riffraff of the lower house. So that's not what they do. But they do have a few things that are pretty powerful. They have the authority to grant licenses to new political parties, which they used to, it was run by the NDP. It was pretty much an NDP entity before the revolution. They also control the Higher Press Council, which regulates the media. So they would manipulate that regulation authority to keep.
Now, Kevin said that from time to time the lights go out. I mean,
just move around.
We are probably in. Well, it's in Egypt, right?
Yeah. The power went out.
The power went out.
So as long as the presentation were okay. And then minimal changes afterwards. Okay. Couple of other things. So this is before the revolution. Good luck trying to run for president. You need 250 written endorsements from members of parliament and local officials, at least 65 from the People's Assembly, at least 25 from the Shura Council, and at least 10 from every local council and at least 14 governorates. It was nearly impossible. There was one other way, which was how Ayman Noor got on and some of the others, is if you had a political party with at least one seat in parliament and you were a member of the senior board of that party. So after the revolution, you know, they got a decree number 12 in 2012, made it a little more difficult to run, and that was, I think, aimed more at Baradei and people who were from the diaspora. So people like myself, for example, couldn't go and say, oh, I want to run for president, putting aside that I'm a female, which is the biggest disadvantage. But so I have no dual citizenship. Parents can't have dual citizenship. Spouse has to be an Egyptian citizen. And then as far as how to get on the ballot, it's a lot, as you can see, a lot lower threshold. Written endorsement from at least 30 members of parliament or signatures of 30,000 eligible votes from 15 governors. That's doable. We have to just get it notarized. And there's over 500 applications right now to be president. So it's going to be really interesting. Okay. The only thing to note here with the presidential elections, again, is there is no right to appeal. And the reason is because it's in the interim constitutional declaration. So there's actually a constitutional crisis. You can't just say, oh, Parliament, why don't you just pass a new law and allow an appeal? Well, but it's in the Constitution. I can't pass a law that violates the Constitution. So there's a lot of, this is something to watch out for in June. There's a lot of anxiety about this because if the PEC, if there's some kind of controversy around the PEC decision, things are not going to be good. Okay, now these are my recommendations, which I've already went through, and I will be very quick. So look at the number of women. Women have already been dismally unrepresented in Egyptian politics and in the parliament. So the quota was passed in 2010. It was supposed to be for only 2 terms. It was a way to kind of boost it and normalize having women in parliament, and then hopefully it would become, you know, more of a cultural practice. So then 8% were in 2007 and 12.7% in 2010. That's based on the quota.
Okay, that's yours, not mine,
yeah.
right?
Sorry. In 2012, which is just after the revolution, only 12 women in the People's Assembly. 8 elected. I believe it's 4 appointed. Some might correct me because I'm trying to find out how many were appointed. But look at the difference. Look at Tunisia. You got 22% because of the gender ordering. So obviously it's making a difference. And for those who are like, oh, that's not fair, this is going to create an all-woman or even a 50%, God forbid, parliament represents the population, it doesn't. It does about 30%. These are the Coptic representations in 2005. This was 2005. 5 were elected, 1 was appointed, so it was already really low. In 2010, they actually did a little better. 8 elected, 5 appointed as the People's Assembly. And then again, this is kind of my recommendation, is to try to deal with that. And then just finally, these are more generic recommendations. The PEC and the HEC, their deliberations are not transparent. There's actually, for the HEC, you have a law that says mandated that it's secret. In other countries, their deliberations and their meetings are public. Observers can come, citizens can come. It's kind of like a local council, city council meeting. It's all very open to the public. So that, I think, should be changed. Obviously, we need an appeals process, which legally is a lot more complicated. And then at least have a debate about whether it's feasible in Egypt, and if it is, when, and because it is more complicated. The judges now need to be trained, because for better or worse, the judges are in it. And they're pretty much the entire election monitoring system at this point. And a lot of them don't really know what they're doing. Rightfully so. So somebody needs to train them. And then the educating the voters, which is a generic recommendation, but the reason why it's important is the HEC used to be mandated to do that. I don't know if they did a good job of it, but they were legally mandated to educate voters and raise awareness and tell voters their rights. That has been taken away from them post-revolution, so there is no government entity that does it. That begs the question, should the government be doing that in the first place? Because Egyptian government isn't known for being the most effective bureaucracy. But if you want to keep the voter turnout high after the post-revolution kind of euphoria, you've got to keep educating the voters. Okay, and that's it. Thank you very much for your patience.